The fifth attribute or characteristic of personhood that God placed among the organisms of the world is personality. God created a spectrum of perfection of personality among at least some of the animals. Evidence of this personality comes in the ability of some animals have to express emotion. For example, octopi, when they get scared, turn bright red. Or when they get mad, they turn bright red, which seems to be an expression of anger or fear. If you raise honeybees, you will notice that even in that case where we're talking about insects, a particular hive of honeybees will have a particular unique personality. One particular hive will be very docile. Another hive would be very dangerous, actually, to be near. They will sting you without any provocation at all. Another hive, you can open it up, stick your hand in there, take the queen out, walk away, and the bees won't sting you. It's really quite amazing. Some seem to be mean, others seem to not be mean at all, and they can be hives right next to each other in an apiary. So even insects seem to have different temperaments. There are instances of animals that mate for most of their life, like the corvids, the ravens, and the crows, that when one of the mates dies, the other will behave for considerable time afterwards in a very unusual and what looks like depressed manner, as if they are bereaving or mourning the loss of their mate. It's interesting that when humans are developing drugs, in medical field, when you're developing drugs for anxiety or depression or other human psychological ailments, you're of course not supposed to do such experiments first of all on humans. You've got to start on animals. Well, if animals don't have anxiety, if no animals had anxiety, you wouldn't be able to test the drugs out for anxiety. And so the fact that we can actually test these kinds of things, test these drugs out on mice, rats, and that sort of thing, indicates that they are capable of the same kinds of emotions as humans are. We have examples. One of my favorite examples is the elephant Sadie. She was a relatively young elephant. She was being trained by her trainers to, I believe it was to move logs in a logging operation in a particular manner. But she wasn't getting it. The trainers would try over and over again to get her to do the same behavior, but she wasn't comprehending or she wasn't remembering. Whatever the situation, she wasn't being successful. After several attempts, Sadie finally just collapsed where she was at. She just dropped down on her knees, her elbows and her knees, and fell over, all the while crying with these big, huge, literally, elephant tears, incapable. And she's sobbing. She's just vibrating the same way a person would vibrate when they're sobbing. She was unable to please her trainers, and so she was upset. She was actually, everything indicated to anyone watching that she was actually very upset, sad, or traumatized that she wasn't able to do what she was supposed to do. In 1996, a young boy fell into a gorilla enclosure and hurt himself as he fell into the pit. The gorilla inside, Binti, crawled over to the boy, picked the boy up, cradled the boy, then took the boy over to the door that the zookeeper would usually come into the cage at, and carefully laid the boy in front of the door and then moved away from the door so that the zookeeper could come in and get the boy, clearly indicating that the well, it's hard to interpret in any other way than the gorilla had compassion upon the boy, tried to comfort the boy, not being successful, actually knew to put the boy into human care so as to meet the needs of the boy. And I'm sure any of you that have had pets or have pets, it's hard to convince somebody who has had pets that pets don't have personality. It sure does seem like they from time to time get angry, they from time to time get sad. If you go away and leave them, even if you leave them in good care, they'll get upset, they'll get sad. You come back and realize you've been gone for a week, and the people you've had take care of your pet say, your pet hasn't eaten a thing. They won't eat. They refuse to eat. And they don't eat until you get back home. They seem to be so sad, at least that's what it seems to be so sad at your absence that they won't even feed themselves. Or in some cases, they get so angry at you having left that they will attack you 4 days afterwards. That sometimes happens, but the point being that it does seem that animals have emotional responses, that they really are capable of true emotion. In addition to that, we have evidence that organisms play. This is, I think, in the same category of having emotion, just playing for the sake of play. Now, some organisms play in such a way when they're young that it seems to prepare them for their behavior later on. For example, you have lions who seem to play as cubs by jumping on each other, sort of simulating the behavior that the adults have in attacking and killing prey. The babies, the young, seem to play in such a way that they're practicing for behavior that's going to be useful later on. Maybe that isn't really play. Maybe that really is practice for later behavior. Although, you watch it and they seem to be having fun at this, as if it is, again, there's an emotional response of fun that is coming in that process. But then there's other examples of organisms that seem to play with behaviors that don't seem to have any advantage to the organism, or don't train the organism into behavior that's going to be useful later on. For example, the fact that at least some dogs seem to chase their tails. I don't think that's very advantageous. I don't know of any behavior that helps a dog develop in the process of doing so. Cats just love, it seems, most of them, love to follow yarn across the room, string across the room, attack it. Maybe that's kind of like jumping on prey, but some of it just seems to be just pure fun. The individual that I referred to who studies ravens find that it's very common for ravens to play. It's very common for a raven to pick up a stick, fly to a very high height, and then drop the stick, and then fly down and catch the stick. Or drop the stick and have another raven come and catch the stick, who would then rise up, drop the stick for the first raven to catch. And they seem to play catch the stick in the middle of the air, which is pretty cool. I've seen a number of YouTube videos of ravens that pick up objects like pieces of bark, carry them up to the top of the roof, the peak of a roof, which is covered with snow, lay the piece of bark down, throw their bodies onto the piece of bark, and sled down the slope of the roof, as if they're sledding. And then when the thing goes off the side of the roof, the raven flies through the air, picks up the piece of bark again, and repeats the process, as if he's just sledding, just having fun, playing in this fashion. Otters do similar things, sliding down snow slopes. Macaques actually roll snowballs in the snow and play in the snow in that sense. There's one rather well-known video that watches a red fox catch a shrew. Now, a shrew would be a little kind of mouse-like organism that would usually be the food for the fox. But the fox picks up the shrew and carries him out to a road and releases him and plays with the shrew in the road. Probably the shrew doesn't think this is a very fun game, but the fox seems to enjoy himself playing with the shrew for a while. At the end of that process, the fox picks up the shrew again, carries him back to the place where he found him, and releases him and goes about his way. He doesn't eat the shrew, he actually just plays with the shrew. I'd had an experience of my own that was interesting. Rafting in the Grand Canyon. It's very common to stop for the night on beaches in the Grand Canyon, which usually be places where rivers are coming in from the side into the canyon and dumping sand in that area of the beach. The same rivers, side creeks, would bring in boulders into the main river and fill up the river. So very commonly, if you're floating down the river on rafts, it would be, most of the river is smooth and slow moving. And then when you get to one of these side canyons with all these boulders out here, the water would go through those boulders in a cascade. And of course, people that are rafting the canyon, they often are interested in those cascades. So there was once when we camped on one of those beaches, and we're right there at one of those cascades. We had put up our tents, and I'm watching the birds out there. There are these wading birds with the long legs that are just floating around in the water. They would be floating around up above the cascades, and then the birds would float all the way through the cascading water, through the rapids. And then as soon as they got down into the water below the rapid, they would fly up and land above the rapids and then just sit there and float in the water, kind of gradually rotating as they floated down, not moving, and then cascade through the rapids again. Now I thought maybe they were picking up insects in the rapids, but carefully watching each one as they went through the rapids, they never ducked into the water to grab anything or grab anything from the air. They seemed to just sit there still, floating through the smooth, slow water, and then cascading through the rapids, then starting over again. And watching dozens of these birds for a couple of hours, I convinced myself that they weren't feeding, they weren't eating, they were simply running the rapids. They were doing the same thing we were doing. We were getting in rafts and going down the rapids and enjoying the rapids. They were floating down the rapids over and over again, apparently just for play. Organisms seem to play in this manner. Then there's some organisms which have perhaps a more sophisticated form of play. What I call practical jokes, where one animal is playing a practical joke on another animal. My best examples here come from the raccoons that we raised at various times as I was growing up. I had one raccoon who seemed to like to spray water on people. By the way, each individual raccoon seemed to have its own practical joke that no other raccoon would do. One of our raccoons seemed to like to spray water on people. We had this, it was what we called a water fountain in the backyard. We had a well with a pump that pumped water up into a pipe. The pipe came up, curled a U-turn, U-turned again, and Dad had put a on-off valve there so you could turn the water on and it would bubble out and you could take a drink. You could turn it off and of course no water would come out. Now we would often turn on that water and our coons would just love to play in the water. They loved it. They enjoy water. One of the coons, only one of the coons, no other coon ever did this. One of the coons had it within their mind, their idea, to get on top of the pipe to play with the water from above, rather than the water as it cascaded down. He went all the way to the edge of the yard, as far away as he could get from the pipe, and started running as fast as he could towards the pipe. Now, raccoons don't actually run. They sort of waddle, waddle fast. So he waddled fast towards the pipe, and about 5 feet away from the pipe, he launches himself into the air to see if he can jump up on top of the pipe, because the pipe is very difficult to climb straight up, so he's going to jump up on top of it. Well, the first time, he hit the pipe on the side short of the top and just kind of slid down the pipe. And he backs up and he hisses at it, all upset that it had hit him or something. And then he ran all the way back to the edge of the yard again and ran again, waddled as fast as he could. This time, he put more oomph into it, and he actually touched the top, but he went right on over, flew right on over the pipe, lands on the ground down below, kind of head over heels, turns around, hisses at the pipe as if the pipe had done something wrong, and then he runs back to the edge of the yard and tries it again. This time he did it just perfectly, just the right distance. He lands on top of this pipe, couldn't have been very comfortable, and hangs over the pipe the way raccoons typically hang over branches, 2 legs on one side, 2 legs on the other, and so he can just dangle there. His feet then are free, and he could reach this water as it was bubbling up. And he was playing with the water with one hand and looking in another direction, of course, when all of a sudden he stuck his finger in and squirted himself. As soon as he's hit by the water, he keels back, but when he does that, he falls off the pipe again. And he hisses at the thing. And then once again, he goes back, runs, gets on top of the pipe again, sticks his finger in there, plays, and just a few seconds, he squirts himself again, falls off again, hisses again, runs up there and does it a third time. This time, he sticks his hand in there and immediately squirts water. But as he moves his finger around, he's not looking, the squirt is aimed in different places. So it wasn't too long after that my dog Alexander the Great came walking by, and the squirrel, without looking, squirted Alex the whole way. He moved his finger around to cause the water to squirt at Alex the whole distance, which of course Alex doesn't mind that sort of thing, so it wasn't a problem. From then on, this coon could get up on top of that thing and squirt anything that was in range. He was very good at it. So we could get somebody, somebody could be visiting for the first time and didn't see the coon. We'd kind of maneuver them around so they had their back to the coon and the well there. And when everything was ready, the coon would stick his finger in there and get that person wet. Even if my sister and I were on either side of the individual, that raccoon could still nail that individual. What is going on there? Why does a coon do that? I don't know of any advantage that it gave to the coon, any survival advantage that it would give to coons in general. It just seemed that was a practical joke played by that coon. And every coon had their own practical joke, and it seemed that every coon did practical jokes. There was another one who our neighbor had, called Old Jugs. That's what our neighbor called him. Old Jugs was kind of unusual among raccoons. Usually, you have raccoons only until the fall, when the call of the wild comes, and then they go and run off and find their mates. But Old Jugs, he stayed around. Now, he didn't stay in the house of our neighbor. He actually stayed in a log cabin that was right next door to that house, the original location of the house. Wasn't used for anything else. He just stayed in the log cabin. But Jugs had a predisposition for women with skirts. Don't know, and nylons. I don't know why. It was just the way Old Jugs was. If somebody came to visit our neighbor, Frank, they came and visited Frank, and it included a woman with a skirt, Frank would position the people, start talking to the people and move them around until they had their back to the log cabin where old Jugs stayed. Now, old Jugs usually only was awake at night and came out during the day. But somehow, don't know how, but somehow when a woman with skirt and nylons appeared, even in the middle of the day, he was awake. And you would see him, and just as soon as this arrangement was in place, as soon as she's in place, you would see old Jugs look around the edge of the log cabin to make sure, and as soon as he saw that woman with a skirt and nylons, his eyes would get big and he would take off. I mean, he would shoot straight towards her as fast as he could go. And now, he was a male coon, big one. He's about 60 pounds or so. He would be moving as fast as he could go, waddling as fast as he could go, and he'd get to within about 5 feet of this woman, and he'd launch himself in the air. And he would throw himself at the back thighs of the woman, grabbing the woman around the front of the legs, and then just slide down her skirt and nylons, tearing the nylons all the way down to the feet. Meanwhile, the poor woman has been standing there unawares and gets hit from behind by a 60-pound coon, hitting her in mid-body region, which of course is going to propel her forward and ultimately to the ground. She's going to be knocked over. But along the way, while she is falling and the coon is sliding down her legs, she is screaming. Of course, I think that's why old Jugs did it. I'm not entirely sure. But she would be, in the end of this thing, she would be on the ground, on her face, and the coon will have been at her feet, and the scream was effectively over, and old Jugs was done. As soon as that was over, he would simply turn around and walk back, very slowly, walk back to his log cabin and disappear and not be seen again. He just came out again. He came out just when women with skirts and nylons came along. Again, what in the world? Seems to be just a practical joke of an animal. My favorite example was one particular raccoon we had. I came out on the porch one day, the deck one day, and I'm looking down at the front of our house, and there is our coon at that time, I don't remember the name of that particular one, who's sitting there with a bowl and eggs. One of the things that true of raccoons is they love eggs. So once you introduce them to eggs for the first time, they know where it came from, they love eggs, and they will. So what you do is you sit a little bowl there, and they'll sit down on their haunches, and you grab a hold of their hands, and you pick up with their hands an egg, and then you break the egg on the edge of the bowl, spilling the contents of the egg into the bowl, stick their fingers into the egg, and then let go. That's all you have to do. At that point, the coon, who is obsessive compulsive being clean, just can't stand this gooey, icky stuff on his hands, so he begins licking his hands to clean them. But along the way, he licks up this egg, which it turns out tastes really good. Every single coon seems to love egg. So the eyes will light up, and then the coon will begin eating the egg. When the coon finishes that egg, the coon will reach over for another unbroken egg, pick it up in exactly the same way that you did with his hands a bit before, break it on the edge of the bowl, and eat the egg. And we'll sit there for hours. If you give him a pile of eggs, the coon will just sit there all day long and sit there on his haunches eating eggs. Favorite thing for a coon to do. I'm looking off the edge of the deck, and there's the coon with a bowl and eating eggs. The usual kind of thing you might see a coon do. And my attention is then diverted to another movement. At this particular time in our yard, Dad had not yet planted the grass of our yard, and so he was processing, creating the appropriate lawn shape, doing the landscaping necessary for our lawn. And up there in Illinois, black soil. So the lawn is pure black, no green grass, just pure black dirt. We had this little white cat short-haired, white, tiny little white cat. And I see that the cat is bounding across the black dirt. Really obvious white cat on black dirt. And he's going doing, 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 doing. And I look back at the coon, and the coon has seen the cat as well. And the coon apparently takes an interest in the cat. So the coon at one point puts his egg down and takes off for the cat. Except my perspective is different. I'm looking at this thing from above. It's very clear that the coon is not aiming directly at where the cat is. The coon is calculating where the cat is going to be and is aiming for the place that the cat is heading for. And the coon is a little bit faster. The coon actually gets there before the cat does. And this really smart, intelligent cat just keeps bounding right along and runs right into the coon. The coon reaches out, coon significantly bigger than the cat, reaches out with his hand and squishes the cat down on the ground. You hear this really weird kind of cry from the cat, and you see 4 white feet go out in all directions under the hand of the coon. Then the coon moves over, scoops up the cat underneath his arm. The cat is making the most horrible sounds. Sounds like something is dying. I've never heard cats make such a noise as that, but the cat is squirming very hard to get out from underneath the coon's hold, but the coon has the cat. And on 3 legs, the coon turns around and carries the cat back to the bowl of egg. Releases the cat scrambles to stand up again, and the coon smashes the cat back down. You got now 4 legs again, facing out in all directions. The coon lifts up the foot a little bit, the cat scrambles to get the feet underneath him, and the coon moves his hand over so that now the cat is laid down on one side. Then with the other hand, and not looking of course, the coon reaches in the egg, takes out some egg on his hand, and grabs the tail of the cat and smears egg on the tail of the cat. Then takes another handful of egg and smears the front leg, and then the other front, and the back leg, and then smears the front face, and then smears the sides of the face, and then does the body. Then releases the cat scrambles up, the coon pulls the cat over on the other side, and proceeds to egg the other side of the cat. Well, now my interest is really piqued at this point. I'm thinking, what in the world is this coon doing? So I've got to keep watching. The coon then scoops up the cat. Cat is screaming, and then proceeds to carry the cat back to where the coon caught the cat, in the middle of the black dirt. Releases the cat, squashes the cat down on the side, and then proceeds to roll the cat in the black dirt. So this egg-covered cat is now covered with this dark gray, black mud. And at this point, the coon leaves the cat and goes back to the place where the eggs were and sits there and proceeds to eat eggs like he was doing before. And of course, you know what the cat's going to do. The cat has to clean itself. So it sits right there and begins licking to proceed to clean itself. I came back a half hour later. The cat's still in the same position, licking itself, still trying to clean itself. The coon's in the same position. An hour later, an hour and a half later, nearly 2 hours later, the cat has finally cleaned itself completely. And the coon is still in that position eating its egg, watching the cat. The cat then gets up and begins to continue the path that it was making across like it had never stopped from 2 hours before. It's going to follow I can even see the footprints. It's following the footprints in exactly the same line. The coon gets up, intercepts the cat at the new position, grabs the cat, and repeats the whole process. Just leaves the cat out there covered with egg and mud. And what is this? It's not, again, in this case, the coon is giving up its favorite food to play this practical joke on this cat. There's no other way, at least I know of, to explain this than that the coon was actually playing a practical joke in this particular process. So we have evidence of personality in the form of practical jokes. We also have evidence of aesthetics in organisms. We have organisms that seem to prefer beauty or color. Bowerbirds, for example, build their nests or bowers with color blue, preferentially, as if they like the color blue. Crows, ravens love shiny things. They love to collect shiny things and put them in their nests. We raised a crow at one point, a name of Herkimer. And every once in a while, we'd keep track of wherever Herkimer's nest was. And every once in a while, we'd take a ladder and go up there and look inside Herkimer's nest. And we'd take out from Herkimer's nest all sorts of rings and necklaces and everything that people in the neighborhood had been missing, because Herkimer would see anything shiny and carry it up into his nest. Or maybe it was her. I'm not entirely sure whether Herkimer was a male or a female. But the crows seem to like or have a preference for shiny things. Doesn't seem to be any adaptive significance, anything that helps them survive. They just have a preference for shiny things. There's evidence for aesthetics among organisms. And so all this together indicates that organisms, in fact, seem to have personality. There's also evidence that animals have self-awareness, recognition of self. How do you recognize that? How do you determine that? Well, the best way scientists have determined to indicate that an animal has self-awareness is to put a mirror into the enclosure with the organism, with the animal, or out in the wild with the animal. If the animal encounters the mirror and basically behaves like there's a second animal in that mirror, another animal that's similar to them in the mirror, then the animal hasn't understood self-awareness. But if the researchers, for example, put a dot on the top of the head of the animal that the animal can't see except in the mirror, if the animal comes to the mirror, looks in the mirror, and reaches up to touch the dot on their head that they see in the mirror, they clearly understand that the mirror is not containing another animal, but is actually themselves. This is the best evidence we know of for an animal being self-aware. And it turns out that cotton-top tamarins, orangutans, and chimps, in fact, respond in such a way as to be self-aware. They recognize the dots on the top of their heads. But most other organisms, in fact, all other organisms, no other organism seems to be self-aware. Elephants don't have any evidence of being self-aware, even though they're smart in a variety of other ways. Rhesus monkeys, marmosets, don't seem to respond. Capuchin monkeys don't seem to respond. In fact, of 50 gorillas that were tested in this manner, only one gorilla, the gorilla by the name of Coco, who happens to be smart enough to learn language, sign language, is the only gorilla known to exhibit self-awareness. So here we have evidence in at least some organisms for self-awareness. In addition, God has created organisms in relationships, in not just interactions over long periods of time, but actually creating life mates, for example. Canada geese produce or enter into mate relationships for life. And whenever a long-term mate has died, the other mate will typically die within a few months, as if they're dying of sadness from the loss of their mate. We have also examples in organisms that are raised together in a home. Even in animals that are of different species, like a cat and a dog, will develop relationships with each other, what looks like friendships with each other, and long-term associations with each other to indicate that at least some organisms are capable of long-term relationships. So through all these things, we see that God has actually placed evidence of uniqueness, activity, intelligence, will, personality, self-awareness, relationships with other beings in animals. They're not found to a full degree in all organisms. So no organism, maybe aside from human beings, is actually a full person, but degrees of the attributes of personhood are found in organisms across the planet. God has placed spectra of perfection of each of the attributes of, or each of the qualities of personhood to point to the God who has perfect and infinite personhood.